Chapter 22. White Seed. It wasn't hard to find the headmaster, since Squall had told him exactly where he needed to go next. He headed off to the infirmary, Rinoa and Zell hot on his heels. They were just as curious as he was. Even Rinoa, who wasn't a seed, wanted the truth. Drive Katawaki looked up when they came in and fixed a polite smile on her face. She wasn't at her desk though. She was standing guard over bed 1.
Sorry, dear,
she told Squall.
You know I don't take visitors when I have patients. Confidentiality and all that. Unless you need treatment, you'll have to. Where is the headmaster?
Squall cut her off. He knew her well and he could tell by the way her eyes tightened that she didn't at all appreciate the rudeness. In this moment though, he didn't rightfully care. If his entire life was a lie, then what did it matter if she was annoyed?
You need to see him?
She asked, her voice chilly at his attitude.
Yes, now.
More rudeness. She was going to make the next treatment he got from her hurt as punishment for this, he just knew it. Drive Katawaki held up her head tall.
Well, you'll still have to come back later. The headmaster is. I'm okay now, doctor,
Sid's voice came from behind her. Drive Katawaki turned with a concerned frown.
Are you sure?
Yes, he breathed out, a sad smile evident even in his voice.
I believe I'm done crying.
The doctor looked at him for a long moment before she let out a breath. She turned back to Squall and beseeched him with her eyes.
Just take it easy, okay? He's got a lot on his mind.
Yeah, he wasn't the only one. Drive Katawaki moved out of the way and Squall stepped into the exam room. Rinoa stayed just a few steps back. Zell leaned against the entrance. The headmaster was standing up as Squall approached, a sad smile indeed plastered over his face. He didn't look like a man that had just been crying. He looked like a man that just had his world ripped out from under him and couldn't handle the strain of it any longer. Then again, maybe that's what a crying person looked like. Squall didn't know. Such moments tended to be kept private and he wasn't close enough to anyone that they would allow him to be privy to that act. Sid chuckled, embarrassed as he ran his hand through his mostly grey hair.
You all see me in such embarrassing states.
Squall didn't care. His headmaster was allowed to be human. He was allowed to have weaknesses. It didn't matter to Squall. In fact, he liked the headmaster just as he was. Sweet, coddling, and capable of crafting the greatest fighters in the world with those traits. Squall let out a breath, unsure where to even start now that he was here. Headmaster Sid smiled at him.
Nort got to you, didn't he? He's always known just what to say to cut a man down or bring him up as suits his own needs. I can't tell you how he used to inflate my ego back in the beginning of all this. Yeah. I mean, no.
Squall trailed off, unsure of himself.
It's all right. You can ask me anything you wish, Squall. I'm not going to hide anything from you or tell you lies. You have a right to the truth. The mission.
Squall finally mumbled. The start. The best place to begin, always.
Your timber mission. The Galbadian mission. The one you didn't really send me on. Ah.
The headmaster nodded along knowingly.
Yes. I'm able to guess easily what must have happened. I'm sorry for that, Squall. You should never have been used in that manner. Headmaster Martin is a coward and abused his power to take control of you with lies. His position gave you no reason to doubt him, and it's not untrue that orders were sent from Balam to Galbadia. You were left with little choice. I don't blame you at all. But we failed?
Squall frowned.
Of course. A common sniper hit against a sorceress? It's a ridiculous kind of plan. If that's all it took to kill one, the sorceress war wouldn't have lasted as long as it did. You all acted with utmost professionalism and skill, though. Given your situation, you behaved perfectly. You were doomed to fail, and despite that you came so close to success. I'm quite proud of you, my seeds.
Headmaster Sid smiled warmly at him, like he really was proud.
What about the others? Selphie and Quistis and Irvine? I sent them off to the missile base and they still haven't reported in. You did what you had to do in a bad situation. And your quick thinking and actions saved all of our lives. I should probably promote you again.
He laughed.
How many times have I already promoted you? What rank are you at? Add 2 to it. Headmaster, please.
Squall frowned. He already felt guilty about it, this was just making it worse.
Squall, Quistis is a prodigy, and Selphie is one of the few transfer students that successfully made seed with no prior training in our garden. Don't underestimate what kind of skill that requires. And Irvine, I'm sure, is just fine. He is, after all, a fantastic sharpshooter. Even if his nerves can fail him at crucial times.
He laughed. Squall blinked. Wait. How did he know that?
What I mean to say is, you did everything I would have expected of you, Squall. And far beyond that. Drive Katawaki told me the shape you were in when you made it back. What you must have endured just to even walk in such a condition.
Sid's smile faded to be replaced by pain.
I cannot ask your forgiveness for such a thing, my boy. I don't deserve it. But please know that I could not possibly be more proud of you if you were my own flesh and blood.
Squall shook his head.
You did nothing to me, Headmaster. It was. I can guess who it was. It's all right. Cypher was always such a free spirit. He had such ambition. I really thought that. Well, too late to regret what was done now. It's not like I would do it differently if I could. Everything I did was done for a reason. Headmaster. What is the real meaning of seed?
Cypher's question was haunting Squall even now. Just because it was so easy and therefore impossible to answer. Even Headmaster Sid looked confused.
Seed is seed. The elite mercenary force of Balam Garden. Why? Were you told something different? Do you know something else about seed?
Squall never knew anything. Headmaster Sid smiled.
The garden will train Seed. Seed will defeat the sorceress.
Squall frowned and looked up. The words had fallen so familiarly from his mouth. Like they were words he had repeated 100 times before. Yet Squall had never heard that revelation before. That didn't mean that. Cypher had been right. Seeds were opposing the sorceress.
You look so surprised,
Sid raised an eyebrow.
Didn't I tell you that during your inauguration? No.
Squall gasped.
Oh. That's right. That faculty member interrupted me before I could say it. I'm sorry, Squall. But it's not really a secret. Any senior Seed member could have told you that. Quistis knows it already. But why? It is our purpose. Seed was conceived for that reason alone. The many missions around the world are only part of the training for the fight against the sorceress. Though, I suppose now that a sorceress has become a major threat, our true mission has begun. I should probably begin recalling the seeds from around the world back to the garden. That still doesn't explain why,
Squall insisted.
To be perfectly honest, I don't know myself,
Headmaster Sid frowned.
I'm merely fulfilling the will of someone much more powerful than either of us. I'm doing my part in a prophecy that she gave me many years ago. A prophecy? Well, I like to call it that. She never used that word. But what else do you call a moment when your wife looks at you and tells you that she's seen the future, then sets you an impossible task like this one? Your wife?
Right. The other thing Nord had said.
He said that your wife was Edia. He can't have meant sorceress Edia, could he? He meant exactly that.
Headmaster Sid rocked on his heels, his face sad and distant.
Though I haven't seen her in many years now. We've exchanged letters, of course, but we haven't been able to meet face to face for far too long. That makes no sense.
Squall shook his head. Headmaster Sid's wife was an evil tyrant? She had tried to blow up her own husband and the task she herself had set him? Were they even talking about the same woman? Maybe there were two sorceress Edias? That somehow seemed to make more sense than what the headmaster was saying now.
She's been a sorceress since childhood, the headmaster explained. She told me she inherited her powers from her adopted mother, who got them from her adopted mother, and so on. She's descended from the least bloody line of sorceresses, the last line of peaceful sorceresses. I married her knowing what she was.
Was he sure? Because the woman that Squall had seen murder a dictator, subjugate an entire nation, and sentence hundreds to die for crimes they hadn't committed was not his definition of peaceful. It really seemed far more the opposite. The two sorceress Edias theory was looking better by the second.
We were happy together. I loved her dearly and she loved me. We tended to stay away from large populations for her safety. No one trusts a sorceress, you know. And there are those who would come after her powers. It was just easier to stay away. Especially after the sorceress war began. It was a simple life, but it was a fulfilling one. Edia and I adopted our children and we built our home and worked our fields together. It remains to this day the happiest time of my life. Then, one day, Edia began talking about building a place called a garden and training seeds. I became obsessed with the idea. I thought it would be a slightly more stringent military academy, but warmer, more like a family. A place where we could raise and teach our children and others. And with such powerful people supporting her, who would dare try to hurt her for the crimes of another sorceress? Then she told me their goal. Told me what must be done. The garden will train seeds. Seeds will defeat the sorceress.
That still made no sense. None of this made any sense. Squall felt like he was listening to a story that was skipping every other page.
Of course I worried about Seed's goal. Especially as the sorceress war was ending and we were about to begin building. I don't know what happened to the tyrant of Esthar, but she must have been deposed somehow. Meaning my wife was the only sorceress left. And if Seed was trained to defeat the sorceress, then didn't it stand to reason they would be coming after her? She laughed. Told me that would never happen. That she wasn't the sorceress Seed was after. But now.
Headmaster Sid sighed, his eyes downcast.
I haven't seen my Edia in so long. Who's to say what has changed in these 10 long years? I still can't believe she would do the things you all say, but I also can't deny that they were done. I have little choice now but to fall back on the vow I made to her to keep pressing on with this. No matter what. Headmaster, please.
Squall shook his head.
I don't understand. You're not the only one. I've told you everything I know about her. About this. Perhaps you can find out more and enlighten me. Where does Master Norg fit in?
He asked, trying to figure out something. Anything.
He is a member of the Shumi tribe,
Headmaster said immediately, like he was grateful for the topic change.
Well, a black sheep of the tribe, one might say. I've met the others, and he really bears very little resemblance to them. I met him while I was running all over Gaia and back trying to find funds to build the garden. He's a businessman and quite successful. He became interested in my ideas and plans about the garden and we hit it off. I will be the first to admit that it was only thanks to his funding that the garden was completed. However, we needed an enormous amount of funds to run the garden. I refused to let this place be common and uncomfortable. If this was going to be the base for my seeds, for my children, then I wanted them to have the best. So they could be nurtured properly and grow strong. That kind of devotion doesn't come cheap though, and Norg wasn't running a charity. Dispatching seeds as mercenaries was his idea, but I went along with it quite willingly. It worked out perfectly. My seeds got to hone their skills, the people of the world had a need satisfied that they didn't before, and we began to make money. At first it was just monsters that normal fighters couldn't quite deal with. Then it was raids. Then it was espionage. As the needs of the clients grew, so too did the seed skill base. It still took a great deal of money to run the garden. But now we were getting an even greater stream of capital back in again. That, I think, was where everything began to change.
Change? Squall frowned.
What do you mean? No, I lost sight of our ideals. Though I kept the message Edia had trusted me with in mind, it became less about training and more about the missions. Norg didn't like leaving his chamber or giving up his power. He hired the garden faculty to let them carry out his will in the garden. And I allowed them control over missions because I had so many other things to watch over. He kept the truth hidden to keep making money, and well, 10 years is a long time to be completely devoted to a cause, no matter the reason. In the end, I only blame myself. I gave up control to Norg and the faculty to make my life easier and I paid for it. I wouldn't say that,
Rinoa said gently from behind Squall, reminding them all that she and Zell were still there.
No.
Sid asked, smiling at her.
No.
She nodded firmly.
Yeah, it got crazy there for a bit, but from what I saw around the garden, you're not the one who gave anything up. Norg cloistered himself away, but you stayed with your students. And when it came down to it, they sided with you. Mostly. Those who weren't bullied into changing sides anyway.
Sid's smile was sad but grateful for her words.
Thank you for saying so.
Squall let out a long breath. He felt almost as confused as when he came in here. More tired. So was his entire life a lie or not? He had a purpose he didn't know about. He had been tortured for crimes that he had, in fact, committed no matter how unknowingly. And he couldn't figure out the riddle that was Sorceress Edia.
So, what do we do now?
He asked, looking back up. Give him a task. Give him a mission. He needed to do something. He couldn't stand having nothing to do. No action to take. It made him feel helpless. Worthless. Headmaster Sid's head fell back slightly as he looked to the ceiling and thought.
Well, we must stop drifting around soon. I've had as many engineering and technology students as possible trying to solve the problem of the dead engine, but they can't even figure out what it is, much less how to make it run again. I only hope that things can go back to how they were. Maybe even better.
So nothing that Squall could do. Nothing he could help with. Meaning he was going to have to just live with being helpless and worthless for an indefinite amount of time. Basically, stand by. How was he going to survive this one? Angelo was playing with the underclassmen in the small courtyard beside the infirmary. They were playing a game of catch the tail that Angelo appeared to be winning quite easily. He would often stop and wag the tempting appendage, then jump away right before the children caught him. It was so easy and uncomplicated. Squall found himself staring at them from the railway of the hallway for a while. Headmaster Sid's words kept ringing in his ears. The half-explanations tormenting him for being nonsensical. Zell was standing back, shadow boxing again. Rinoa was hesitating. Then, slowly, as though unsure of herself, she came forward and leaned against the rail beside him.
So?
She looked over.
So what?
He asked, his voice dead.
What do you want to do now?
Must he do anything? Why was he always the one to decide? And how could he possibly know? He couldn't stop the garden. He couldn't defeat the sorceress. He couldn't even understand what life he was living right now. He didn't want to decide. He didn't want to think. He just wanted. He wanted.
Let's go buy some fish from the quad guy,
he said, pushing himself up. Rinoa smiled and stepped back.
You still owe me a tour of the second floor. So I do.
He didn't need to plan that. He didn't need to decide that. She had already decided on it for him. He just had to follow her orders. And what a simple, easy thing that was to do. It required no thought from him and removed that burden from his shoulders. It was a sweet release.
So, what quad guy is selling fish?
Zell asked, falling into step beside them.
The one with the fishing rod, of course,
Rinoa laughed. She didn't mind Zell being here so much anymore. At least with him around, it wouldn't fall silent and the gears in Squall's head could stop grinding together quite so loudly. They didn't get far. Sue was rushing down the steps from the elevator as they stepped into the Nexus. She caught sight of them and Squall frowned as she picked up the pace. Damn.
Squall. Squall.
She called out, skidding to a half in front of him.
Have you seen the headmaster around? He's in the infirmary. What's wrong?
Rinoa asked, frowning at her fearful tone.
Go to the second floor deck and see for yourself. There's a ship approaching. It could be Galbadians or worse, the sorceress might be aboard coming to attack us. I have to tell the headmaster right away.
She took off running at the same time Squall did. They rushed past each other, Squall aiming for the elevator. Rinoa and Zell took off after him. By the time they reached the second floor deck, the ship had already pulled up beside them. Long, slightly older, but no less impressive for that. Squall walked closer to the edge and found himself looked down at 3 pairs of eyes that were waiting below for someone to arrive.
Ho, there!
The man in front called, his voice formal.
What do you want?
Squall demanded, his hand reaching for the hilt of his gun blade.
Is Headmaster Sid with you?
The man asked. Squall was instantly suspicious.
No, he's not. Are you from Galbadia? No, we are seeds. This is Edia's ship. We are Sorceress Edia's seed.
Squall started. That was hardly a reassuring thing to hear. Unless... could they be talking about the same Edia that the headmaster had been? An apparently sweet, simple woman that had been the start of Seed? He was so confused.
We're coming aboard.
The man below yelled.
We're unarmed.
Squall stepped back quickly as three jumped, timed perfectly, launched the seeds up into the air. They flipped at the crest of their peak and landed neatly on the deck. Their uniforms were so different from Squall's. The black leather and ornate decorations had been replaced with what looked like a sturdy, almost white material that looked so familiar to Squall. It took him a moment to remember where he knew them from. Yeah. He had seen those once before. He had seen the man before him once before too. He was one of those that escorted the girl with no fashion sense from the training center after she had been attacked by a monster. He was not to be trusted. He had associated himself with Edia. The very same Edia that had nearly killed then tortured Squall. He was not inclined to even let them near the garden. His hand went to his weapon immediately upon their landing. Behind him, Rinoa and Zell similarly took ready positions. They followed him naturally, without question.
Please, we come in peace,
the leader said, holding up his hands to prove he had no weapons. Squall could see the empty spots on his belt where he would hang his weapons if he had them. Just by the way he was walking, Squall could tell he was uncomfortable to go unarmed. Slowly, suspiciously, Squall relaxed from his position, but didn't quite release his weapon. Behind him, Zell and Rinoa similarly relaxed.
You claim to side with Edia?
Squall asked him, his voice low.
Yes,
the leader nodded once.
We are her personal seeds. We mean you no harm. You'll forgive me for not quite believing you.
The leader nodded again, accepting his disbelief.
That is neither here nor there. Please, we must speak to Headmaster Sid. Where is he? I'm right here.
Keeping his eye on the man who called himself Edia's seed, Squall stepped back and allowed his headmaster to approach. He only got more tense, however, as the old man moved in closer. Squall didn't like the idea of his headmaster so close to an unknown. Sue, just a step behind the headmaster, appeared to share his misgivings. Her hand was twitching, like she was resisting the urge to pull out a weapon, and she stayed right on the headmaster's feet. Close enough to block any attack that came towards him.
Headmaster,
the leader bowed his head slightly, respectfully.
We've come for Elone. It's too dangerous here now to allow her to remain.
Elone? That little girl from Win Hill? No. Headmaster Sid looked quite sad, but he nodded in agreement.
You're right. I'm afraid I'm failing quite often lately, I can't even protect her. Please, sir, we didn't mean it like that.
The leader looked disturbed at the interpretation of his words. Headmaster Sid cut him off by holding up his hand with a gentle smile.
It's quite all right.
Squall.
Yes, sir.
He straightened, looking to him.
You know who she is.
He did.
Please, go find her and bring her here. She's somewhere in the garden, I know.
He didn't know her though. Not so far as the headmaster knew anyway. Squall would definitely remember seeing that tiny girl after those dreams. Who were these people anyway? How were they connected to Elone? Was it even the same Elone? Squall! The headmaster called, frowning at his lack of reaction. Squall snapped himself out of it and nodded once.
Yes, sir.
Obedient, Squall turned to run back into the garden. Zell and Rinoa followed him, leaving Sue behind to defend the headmaster against the 3 seeds if necessary. Squall felt more than a little confident that she could still handle herself. As the 3 of them hit the 2nd floor hallway, Zell turned to Squall, his face lit up.
Squall, Elone's that girl, hey? You know, that little girl Laguna was taking care of. Right.
Was she? Could it be someone different?
Maybe,
Squall said, his fingers numb. Zell made a face.
What's she look like? I didn't actually get to see her. I was kind of in the prison for that dream. Right. She was about this big. Brown hair, pale skin.
She looked like a pixie.
So she's in the garden.
Zell looked around eagerly like the tiny tot might jump out from one of the classrooms.
You would think you would have recognized her. Well, maybe not if she's an underclassman, especially a really young one. Let's split up and find her. I'll cover the 2nd floor. Rinoa and I will split up the 1st,
Squall said. Zell nodded and ran off. Rinoa fell in step beside Squall as they headed back towards the elevator.
Hey, Squall,
she started cautiously.
Who's Elone? She's a person in the dream world. A child. Laguna was taking care of her in Windhill.
Rinoa hummed thoughtfully but kept to herself as they stepped into the elevator. They rode down in silence, and when they stepped out, Rinoa pointed right.
I'll cover the infirmary to the quad. You go over that half. Meet you at the dorms.
Squall nodded and watched as Rinoa ran off. Was it the same Elone? Could it possibly be her? Why would he not have noticed the tiny, pixie-faced girl running around the garden? He had just been watching Angelo play with the underclassmen. There weren't many that remained when the garden had gone up in chaos. Surely if she was here, he would have noticed her already. It was hard to hide a pixie girl that haunted his. The numbness in Squall's hands started spreading as he stepped forward. Moving slowly, like he was afraid to reach his destination, Squall walked towards the library. The girl with no fashion sense hadn't moved from earlier this morning. She was even reading the same book, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. She heard him approaching and looked up. A smile, partly sad, partly happy, broke out over her face as she turned to face him. A pixie face. The same purred nose. Identical hair color. Older now, but she still looked like a perfect cross between the parents Squall had seen a picture of in his dream. Her hands folded in her lap as the pixie girl, who had to be well past 20 years old now, smiled at him like she had been waiting a long time just for this moment.
Yes, Squall?
She asked, his name coming from her lips like she knew him well.
Are you Elone?
He asked, his whole body numb.
Yes.
Her smile started to widen. She had wanted him to remember her. She was waiting for it. He still didn't.
You're Elone.
He pressed, his heart skipping a beat.
The Elone. Yes, of course,
she laughed at his reaction. Then frowned as she realized he wasn't recognizing her at all. He only knew her from the dream. Her smile turned sad, her eyes swimming with emotions he didn't want to recognize. What was going on? This couldn't be her. Yet she looked just like her. She didn't deny it.
You know Laguna, don't you?
She smiled, looking off into the carpet.
I do. I really love Uncle Laguna. It's been a while since I've seen him.
There it was. That title. She couldn't have known that unless she had been in the dreams. Or she had been there when they weren't dreams.
Then tell me.
He stepped forward.
What is this? What are we experiencing?
Elone made a face, like he had asked her to describe the technicalities of making a gun blade.
I'm sorry, Squall. It's hard to explain.
Squall growled, turning away in anger. Elone looked saddened by his reaction as she stood up. Squall didn't move as she walked past him, stopping just a few feet away.
But one thing. It's about the past.
So they were viewing the past. Her past. Laguna's past. And she knew about it. He hadn't even needed to specify what he was talking about. So she knew about the dreams. About something the seeds had not even yet told Headmaster Sid about. She had something to do with it. Or maybe. Elone sighed as her head leaned back, tilting her head to look up at the elegant filigree designs inlaid in the ceiling. She answered the question so obviously on his mind without him needing to ask it. She made a face before turning to face him. Face the back he kept to her.
People say you can't change the past. But even still, if there's a possibility, it's worth a try, right?
Change the past? Was she serious? That was ridiculous. You couldn't change the past. What had already happened was set in stone. Nothing could change it.
Are you the one responsible?
Squall demanded, turning with blazing eyes, finding himself getting angry.
Are you the one taking us to that dream world? Why?
Elone looked down at her hands.
I'm sorry. I have to. I can't.
She floundered, unsure of how to express herself.
Why me? I have enough problems as it is. Don't get me involved in this. I don't even know you.
Elone flinched like he had hit her. The guilt was resting heavy on her frame, but she stood resolute before her decision. He was angry. She supposed he had the right to be. But she couldn't stop. Not now. Not when she might still have an opportunity to make things right. For Squall, for Uncle Laguna, for everyone.
I'm sorry,
she breathed, tears gathering in her eyes, wishing she could explain it to him. Wishing she had the courage to tell him. But his words were ringing painfully in her ears. He wouldn't listen right now if she tried to tell him the truth. Looking into his face, seeing the distance he had put between them since the last time they met, she knew she couldn't even try. What reason would he have to believe her? More than that, what would it even accomplish?
Don't!
Squall breathed, stepping away. That emotion was back in her eyes. It was beating at his heart in a way that filled him with abject and total fear. His legs, numb, were giving out on him as he backed away from her.
Don't depend on me.
His knees hit the chair she had just vacated and he found himself slumping down into it, turning his back towards her once again. Elone had to fight back her sobs. Squall didn't want to help her. He didn't want to change her past. With every confusing, nonsensical thing already in his life, he didn't need her adding this. He didn't need her problems on top of everything else. Squall. She looked at him sadly. Squall. Elone looked over. Squall hadn't even flinched. Sue walked into the library, frowning at him.
Did you find Elone?
The girl in question held up her hand slightly.
I'm Elone.
Sue nodded, smiling at her. Then she looked back at Squall and frowned.
Are you all right?
No. Elone frowned at him. At the sight he made with his back to her. He wouldn't turn around to face her, and that was a different kind of pain. Calm and sad, she walked over to him. Her hand on his shoulder was warm, her voice in her ear was trembling in desperation. She walked away with Sue, leaving Squall behind. Leaving him alone. What she said under breath.
You're my only hope.
Elone followed Sue up to the second-floor balcony. She was rather certain she knew what she was going to find there before Sue finished explaining about the unknown ship. Why do people depend on each other? The seeds, Edia's seeds, looked relieved to see Elone alive and well. She smiled at them, familiar with each of their faces. She called out to them by name as Sue led her out onto the deck. In the end, you're on your own. Headmaster Sid took Elone's hands and he found himself apologizing. For his own weakness. For his inability to promise her safety here at the garden. I've made it this far by myself. Sure, I couldn't do a thing when I was a kid, but... Elone shook her head and threw her arms about the elder man. He hugged her back after a second and Sue looked surprised at the familiarity. I've depended on others. Elone moved towards the seats and she smiled as the leader took her by the hand. He asked if she was ready to go and she looked back one more time at the garden. I'll be the first to admit that I'm here because of other people. The leader, carrying Elone, jumped her down to their ship. She waved at Headmaster Sid with a bright smile as they pulled away. The helpless garden was an immobile rock in comparison to the speed of the ship as it hauled Elone away. I'm fine by myself now. Squall looked up at the ceiling of his bed. Shiva, tucked away in her capsule, was sitting on his desk, so his thoughts were his own. In the darkness of the ocean nights, there was nothing to distract his own mind from plaguing his sanity. I have all the skills I need to survive. I'm not a child anymore. He turned over, nearly curling in on himself. That's a lie. I don't know anything. I'm confused. I don't want to depend on anyone. How can I do that? Someone just tell me. Squall's body unfolded as the irony of the statement hit him and he laughed at himself without any real humor. Someone? So I'll end up depending on others after all. It was a dream. Not one of Elone's dreams. His own dream. The rain poured down all around him, soaking his body through. Back when he felt cold. The constant dripping was running down his back, soaking into his shoes. He was shivering, his fingers were burning in their numbness. Yet he couldn't bring himself to go back inside. The stone building behind him, with warmth seeping from the walls, was no place for him. What he wanted, what he needed, couldn't be found inside.
Sis. I'm all alone.
The voice of a child. The stubby limbs of youth. His voice was high. Only his stormy grey eyes, so off-putting in such a young face, remained the same.
But I'm doing my best,
he continued, wiping his running nose. He was going to get sick standing out in this rain. He didn't care.
I'll be okay without you, sis. I'll be able to take care of myself.
Rinoa made no efforts to be quiet this time. She didn't want to nearly get punched in the face again for disturbing a sleeping seed, so she made her footsteps just a little bit more deliberate this morning when she walked into Squall's room. His eyes snapped open and she saw his limb twitch like he was reaching for a weapon. He didn't attack her this time, though he did swing his feet out of bed rather quickly. Wakefulness returned to him in full force rather quickly as he looked to her.
Hey, again,
she beamed, waving.
Do you ever knock? When the mood strikes me. Do you ever wear a shirt to bed?
Hein, please say no.
I like the cold.
She grinned.
I know you do. And it's not like people regularly see me at night. They usually don't just walk into my room. Or they knock if they need my attention.
Rinoa smiled. She was going to take that as a no and be grateful.
So, am I going to have to steal your jacket again this morning to make you come out with me? I'm not letting it happen a second time. What do you mean come out? I want to go for a walk. Again. That was a guided tour. This time, it's a walk.
She beamed. He resisted the urge to sigh. He really wasn't in the mood this morning. That had been a very restless night. He was still tired. He felt weirdly detached from his body right now. He wouldn't make a good companion today.
Just go by yourself. You're safe here. It's not that I want a guard with me,
Rinoa frowned, stepping in close to him.
You know, you're always too deep in thought. Why don't you lighten up a little? It's not good to think too much. I really just want to be alone.
Her head tilted curiously.
Why?
Why? What kind of question was that? He just did.
Why don't you talk to me instead?
Rinoa smiled gently, reaching out to put her hands on his shoulders. Squall jumped slightly. He hadn't realized, with his eyes down on the floor, just how close she had gotten. He could feel her body warmth as she smiled at him. She reached down and stroked back his hair like she had that day on the train when he had rested on her lap. Talk to her. Yeah, right. There was no point in talking to anyone. What could she even do? There was nothing that could be resolved or absolved by speaking with Rinoa. It would be no different than talking to a wall. A wall with big brown eyes and a smile that made his heart beat just a little faster. In comparison, the idea of talking to a wall was just.
You might feel better,
Rinoa pressed. She grabbed his head and forced him to look up at her.
If you unload all those thoughts in here on me, it could lighten the burden a bit. It won't change anything,
he said softly.
Maybe not. But I want to know what you think. Why? Because I do. I don't need a reason.
Yes, she did. It made no sense to him.
I guess what I'm trying to say is...
Grinning, Rinoa stepped back. She grabbed the edges of her duster like a dress and curtsied to him quite gracefully. When she spoke, she had elevated her voice haughtily.
It would be my honor to have your company, Your Highness, in the hopes that I may get your mind off of things. For a little while. How about it, Your Highness?
She lifted her eyes back up, still deep in her curtsy. And damn if she wasn't adorable. How did she always know exactly what to do to make his heart beat faster and his head feel lighter? The laughter in her brown eyes was almost infectious. The grace of her body as she dipped into the move made him want to grab hold of her. Damn. Even now, when it felt like he had never felt worse, she got to him.
Fine,
he said, standing up.
Oh, thank you, Your Highness.
Rinoa dipped lower into the curtsy before standing up again, smiling at him happily.
Where do you want to go?
Rinoa thought for a moment. She didn't really have a destination in mind, but she couldn't imagine that Squall was the type to meander around meaninglessly. He needed a place to get to. A point B for his point A.
Take me. Somewhere you wouldn't take anyone else.
Squall stared, confused. What did that even mean? She smiled, putting her hands behind her back.
I want you to give me something special. Something you wouldn't give to anyone but me.
His first impression of this girl, that she used difficulty, only proved more true each day. She wanted him to make concessions for her. To put her above everyone else. She was going to demand more from him than anyone ever had. And hind damn him if he didn't want to give her exactly that. He had no problem giving her what she wanted. He was already casting his mind around, trying to figure out a place that would suit.
You know this is a public garden, right? The only place I've never taken anyone else is the sub-levels, and if you really want to go there again...
Rinoa laughed.
It doesn't have to be completely unique. It just has to be special. I'll let you get dressed. Don't leave me waiting too long.
When Squall walked back out of his room after a few minutes, Rinoa frowned because he had put his jacket back on. He adjusted the collar, giving her a look. She hadn't demanded he didn't wear it this time. The look on her face told him that she knew that very well. That didn't stop her from grabbing onto his arm. It was a little more awkward this time because of the thick leather of his jacket and her own weapon. She was never leaving it behind again. She had learned her lesson yesterday. Squall grinned at the sight of it. Together, the two of them walked into the garden. There were more people around to stare today because someone had seen Rinoa walking towards Squall's dorm and alerted everyone else about the potential show. Those that missed it yesterday, those that couldn't believe it yesterday, wanted to see a girl hanging from his side. They still couldn't quite believe it. Squall had never minded their staring before. It was really getting annoying now. What were they acting so surprised about? It was kind of insulting. Squall aimed himself for the training center and Rinoa frowned. She didn't say anything until they were walking down the hallway, without a doubt heading that way.
You know, when I said I could see you taking someone here on a first date, I didn't think you would actually go through with it. I thought this was a second date.
Rinoa grinned to herself. That meant he was acknowledging yesterday as a first date. Well, if this is what made him happy, she was here to get his mind off of things. She'd play with the monsters with him until he got tired of it. The two of them moved at almost the same time to junction their GFs. Squall pulled his gun blade from his inventory and attached it to his hip. Rinoa unfolded the edge from her blaster. Then he hit the release on the doors and they stepped inside. The artificial forest that the seeds had created to train was actually quite a beautiful place. While the marks of battle were apparent everywhere, and the path beneath their feet was partially metal, the place was still rather lovely. There was even a pond with a waterfall that served as a waterhole to the monsters. The plant life that grew here was flourishing and the monsters were tough. The weak ones were always killed off, so that left only the strongest of the monsters behind to train the cadets. Though a couple times, as they were walking through, Rinoa could hear T-Rexors moving out in the trees, they only saw grats, which she could take care of easily at this point. Which was handy since they attacked in pairs, in threes, against the two of them. It wasn't until halfway through that she realized Squall was walking with purpose. He wasn't just wandering around looking for fights. He had a destination in mind. At the very back of the training center, there was a walkway to a door that was too small for any of the monsters here to fit through. Squall walked past it easily, Rinoa a step behind him. She looked around curiously at the thin staircase that they took upwards. The door of the observation deck, of the secret area, had been damaged slightly when the garden began moving. Squall had to jam his shoulder against it a few times to push his way through. Then he pulled back the door from the other side so Rinoa could step out. She took in an odd breath. From up here she could see over the entirety of the forest. She could see the garden, so beautiful, at the other end. She could look back and see the water surrounding them just behind the tower.
"What is this?"
she asked breathlessly, stepping forward to the rails as Squall released the door. It closed partially back into place.
"It's an old observation deck the clones used to use,"
Squall said, watching her carefully.
"They didn't like having to fight monsters to get out here though, so they stopped. Then people used it as a meeting area for some illicit PDA since the faculty couldn't stop them here. Since they betrayed us though, they lost their power and people haven't needed to hide. And mostly they've started going to the quad since it's less of a hassle."
"So?" Rinoa turned at the rails and looked back at him, grinning.
"This is like a make-out point."
Squall shrugged. She had asked for some place special. This was the only place in the garden that he knew of that served a meeting point for couples. He didn't know if that's what she meant though. He was just trying to fulfill her request. He wasn't sure how well he did.
"You've never taken anyone here before?"
Rinoa asked, tilting her head at him.
"No. Well, Quistis brought me here once." "She did?"
Rinoa looked surprised.
"She wanted to talk. Will it serve?"
Rinoa grinned. The place was empty. The new hotspot had considerably less monsters. So they were finally alone. What she had wanted all along. She felt almost silly for doubting her seed's ability to give her what she requested of him.
"It's perfect. If you would stop standing over there and come join me, that is."
Squall hesitated only a moment before stepping up beside her. He leaned against the rails and she turned back around. She smiled over the forest.
"So? What's on your mind, Squall?"
What wasn't on his mind lately? He couldn't find any answers to his questions, so they just buzzed around in his brain, driving him insane. Rinoa looked at him when he didn't respond. Maybe talking it out wouldn't help him. If he couldn't answer his questions, then they couldn't be put to rest. Which, for him, would be the only thing to give him peace. So she tried a new tactic.
Squall, what's your favorite color?
He started, confused.
What? Your favorite color? You have one, don't you? What is it? Brown.
The word came from his mouth immediately and Rinoa frowned.
Brown? Well, that's kind of boring. Why brown?
Because it was the color of her eyes. He wasn't answering that.
What's your favorite color?
He returned, trying to change the topic from him.
Blue,
she laughed, touching her duster.
The color of the sky. The color of the water. It's such a pretty, calming color. But it's also happy.
She had put a lot more thought into her favorite color than he did. He wasn't taking it back though. The bright brown of her eyes was the only color he found interesting at the moment. Rinoa looked over and caught his eye. She grinned, her cheeks flushing under his gaze. Even just talking about colors, he was still on.
You're so serious,
she laughed.
Do not call me cute. But you are.
Rinoa snuggled closer to him and he let out a sigh.
Okay, I won't say it. Have you ever considered not taking every subject so life and death seriously though? You're starting to remind me of my father. Don't.
Rinoa looked up, surprised by the firmness of his voice.
Don't what? Don't compare me to him. I'm not your father. I'm aware.
Rinoa tilted her head as he continued to stare at her.
Why do you not want me to though?
Because she hated her father. Squall didn't say it, but he didn't really need to. Rinoa could see it in his eyes as he quickly looked away from her. She smiled and leaned over to rest her head on his shoulder.
You want me to tell you what my father did wrong?
He didn't say anything, which she took as yes. If he hadn't wanted to know, he would have told her as much. That he was silent was more telling than his words.
He wouldn't stop working,
she said, frowning out into the distance.
Back when I was little and my mother was around, he was around more often too. But I found out after my mother died that he only spent so much time around us because she would threaten to leave him if he didn't. Since I couldn't leave him, he didn't have to try to stay around me. He would start working for weeks at a time. He ignored me. He didn't care what I did so long as I always did exactly what he wanted. For a long while, I obeyed, because I thought if I was good, he would pay attention to me again. When he never did, I started rebelling. He still didn't pay attention to me, but he got even more strict. So I left.
Rinoa smiled up at him and wasn't surprised to see him already looking down at her, absorbing everything that she said. Squall always listened. He was always right there.
You're a lot like him. You're both military men, very stiff and dutiful. But, you don't expect me to fall into a perfect mold. You accept me as I am. And you don't tune me out when I talk. You take everything a little but too seriously. It's kind of see.
She cleared her throat.
It's nice. I'm not asking for you to dote on me all day, every day. I just want some attention every now and again. That doesn't seem like such an unreasonable request,
Squall agreed neutrally. Rinoa smiled and reached up to stroke his cheek, to touch the edge of the scar that was imprinted across the bridge of his nose. He reached up suddenly and caught her hand in his before she could, surprising her. He held on to her fingers, his thumb pressing against her palm as those stormy grey eyes of his washed over her. Rinoa's heart started racing in her chest. Her lips parted slightly at their closeness and his eyes tracked the movement, lingering there for a long moment. Squall could feel her heartbeat in the pulse of her wrist. He could see it in the blush across her cheeks as she looked at him. Those big brown eyes tempting him forward. His body turned just slightly, more directly facing her. And, without thinking, she took a small step forward to close that gap between them. The cold coming off of his skin was ticking her flesh in a titillating sort of way. Conversely, the heat coming off of Rinoa's skin felt almost like it was burning along Squall's nerves. His other hand reached out, wanting to take her waist as she moved in closer. He could make out each of her individual eyelashes from this distance. His own heart started to race. From her nearness. From her scent. From realizing what he was about to let himself do. The happy chiming of the intercom system shattered the spell over them neatly. The two jumped apart as Headmaster Sid's voice came over the air, like he might have walked in on them.
"Hello, everyone,"
he greeted cheerfully as Squall and Rinoa looked away from each other.
"This is the Headmaster speaking. I'm happy to report that the lines have finally been fixed and I'm back on the air. Hurrah! Whoa!"
Squall and Rinoa shared a worried look.
"Squall. This is the Headmaster speaking. Please come to my office. I repeat, please come to my office right away."
The sun was beaming down pretty hot today. Even a master fisherman like himself, tanned from years out on the water, would quickly find himself drying up in this heat. If it hadn't been for his trusty umbrella over his head. It was nice though. Made him feel rather sleepy. Apparently made the fish rather sleepy too. Frowning at their lack of activity, the fisherman pulled back his line and threw it out again. Usually there were plenty of fish out here near the wind turbine columns. This old support beam was one of his favorite spots to fish from. He had his chair, his umbrella, and his bucket of bait all set up in preparation for the haul he would bring. If he could bring anything in. As good as he was, he couldn't magically make the sea give up her bounty if she wasn't already inclined to do so. Like any good woman, she required him to stroke and cajole and love her until she opened herself up to him.
"Boy, it's been a slow day,"
he said.
"Come on, baby. Give me a big one."
It was the rushing of the water that first alerted him that something was wrong. He had been staring at these waters for years. He knew their ripple patterns. The sudden, strange, large waves that echoed around the turbine columns was unusual. The sort of thing he would see around an incredibly large vessel. But if something so huge was coming for them, surely he would have been alerted to its arrival earlier. The fisherman looked over, following the ripples, and jumped to his feet. Balam Garden, so massive in relation to everything around it that it made him feel like a flea, was bearing down on him. The water rushed out of its path. The wind turbines that had seemed so large just moments ago shattered against the hull of the garden as it rushed through the area. Then his mistress decided to be funny. As he stared, frozen with fear at the monolith bearing down on him and his post, he felt a jerk against his fishing pole. Then another. The steady yanking of a fish caught on his hook pulled him from his open-mouthed staring. Automatically, he grabbed for the reel and started trying to pull the fish in. All the while, he stared at the enormous garden that crept steadily forward. More turbines crumbled. The momentum of the garden kept it going. The fisherman yanked on the large fish dangling from the end of his pole. Too close. The entirety of his vision was filled with the vessel. He had to get out of here. The fish tempted him again. Survival instincts barely won out. He dropped the pole and started sprinting back up the girder. The garden hit multiple turbines in a row and they cracked and bent and crumbled. It slammed against the outer edges of the ocean town of Fisherman's Horizon, and there was a great explosion of water up around the girder that the master fisherman had barely abandoned in time. End of chapter.